The perfect summer day turned into every parent's worst nightmare when 6-year-old Joshua disappeared from his own backyard. 5 years of searching, 5 years of sleepless nights, 5 years of wondering if their little boy was still out there somewhere. The answer had been right next door all along, hidden beneath an old dog kennel that nobody thought to check. The Hallbrook family lived the kind of life people dream about. Ethan worked as an architect downtown, Sarah taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school, and their son Joshua was the light of their lives. With his bright red hair and face full of freckles, Joshua was impossible to miss in any crowd. He had just turned 6 that spring, and his energy seemed endless. The boy could spend hours outside, creating adventures with his toy trucks and action figures, turning their backyard into whatever magical world his imagination conjured up that day. Their town was one of those places where everyone knew everyone. Kids rode their bikes freely through the streets, neighbors borrowed cups of sugar without thinking twice, and summer barbecues brought the whole block together. It was the kind of community where people still left their doors unlocked and watched out for each other's children. The Hallbrooks had moved there specifically because it felt so safe, so perfect for raising a family. They had left the city behind 3 years earlier, trading their cramped apartment for a house with a real yard where Joshua could play and grow up the way kids were meant to. Next door to them lived Mr. Abernathy, though most people just called him the old man on Maple Street. He had been there longer than anyone could remember, at least 40 years according to the other neighbors. Abernathy kept to himself mostly, rarely joining the neighborhood gatherings or even waving when people passed by. His house looked tired, with paint peeling in places and a yard that needed more attention than it got. In the back corner of his property sat an old wooden dog kennel, weathered and gray from years of sun and rain. Nobody could remember him ever having a dog, at least not in recent memory, but the kennel remained, like everything else about Abernathy's property, forgotten and neglected. Some of the kids in the neighborhood thought Abernathy was creepy, the way he would sometimes watch them from his window. But the adults just saw him as a harmless old man, maybe a bit odd, definitely lonely, but nothing to worry about. He paid his taxes, kept his grass cut just enough to avoid complaints, and minded his own business. In a neighborhood full of young families and constant activity, Abernathy was like a piece of old furniture that everyone had gotten used to and stopped noticing. His mailbox was always full, suggesting he didn't get much correspondence, and his garbage cans went out maybe once a month, indicating a solitary life with little waste or activity. That day in July started like any other summer day. The temperature was already climbing by 8 in the morning, promising to be one of those scorchers that made everyone grateful for air conditioning and swimming pools. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and Joshua had been up since 6 asking when he could go outside to play. Sarah made him eat breakfast first, scrambled eggs and toast with his favorite strawberry jam, before letting him loose in the backyard. She watched him run out with the boundless energy only children possess, his laughter floating back through the screen door as she cleaned up the breakfast dishes. Ethan was working on a project in the garage, fixing an old dresser he had promised Sarah he would refinish months ago. The piece had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, and restoring it had become one of those weekend projects that never quite got completed. He told Joshua he would come out and play catch with him in about 20 minutes, just needed to finish sanding one more drawer. Joshua had nodded eagerly, already distracted by whatever adventure was forming in his imagination. Joshua ran outside with his favorite toy truck, a big red fire engine his grandparents had given him for his birthday. The backyard was his kingdom, complete with a swing set, a sandbox, and plenty of space to run around. There was a large oak tree that provided shade in one corner, perfect for playing underneath on hot days like this one. Ethan could hear him making siren noises and creating some elaborate rescue scenario as he worked. The garage door was open, giving Ethan a partial view of the yard, though his focus was on the dresser in front of him. The rhythmic sound of Joshua's play was a comfortable background noise, as familiar as breathing. 20 minutes passed quickly when you were focused on something. Ethan set down his sandpaper, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and walked out to the backyard. The silence hit him first. No siren noises, no sound of Joshua's voice creating dialogue for his imaginary rescue workers. The red fire truck sat abandoned in the grass near the sandbox, but Joshua was nowhere to be seen. A cup of lemonade Sarah had brought out for him sat untouched on the picnic table, ice cubes still mostly intact. At first, Ethan wasn't worried. Joshua sometimes wandered to the side of the house or went around front without saying anything. Kids did that, following butterflies or investigating interesting rocks. But when Ethan walked around the entire house calling his name and got no response. The first flutter of concern started in his chest. He went inside and asked Sarah if Joshua had come in. She hadn't seen him. They both went outside, calling louder now, checking behind every bush, every tree, even inside the small shed where they kept the lawnmower. Sarah looked in the treehouse they had built together last summer, though Joshua rarely went up there alone. The panic started to build when they realized Joshua's favorite hiding spots were all empty. Sarah ran to the neighbors on the left, the Johnsons, while Ethan checked with the family on the right. Nobody had seen Joshua. Mrs. Johnson immediately started checking her own yard and pool area. Within 10 minutes, half the neighborhood was searching, calling Joshua's name with increasing urgency. Within 20 minutes, Ethan had called the police, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial the numbers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Police cars filled the street, officers spread out through the neighborhood, and soon search dogs were brought in. They showed the dogs Joshua's pajamas from the night before, watched as the animals picked up the scent and started tracking. The dogs led them around the yard to the back fence, and then seemed confused, circling back on themselves as if the trail just ended. One dog kept returning to the same spot near the fence line, whining softly, but the trail seemed to stop cold, the heavy tarp and sealed boards blocking any scent from escaping the hidden cellar below. An amber alert went out within 2 hours. Joshua's picture, the one from his recent birthday party where he was grinning with cake frosting on his nose, was suddenly everywhere. Television stations interrupted their regular programming. Social media exploded with shares and comments, and volunteers started showing up by the dozens to help search. People who didn't even know the Hallbrooks brought water and sandwiches for the searchers, set up tables to coordinate efforts, and offered to help in any way they could. They searched everywhere methodically and desperately. The woods behind the neighborhood were combed through inch by inch, volunteers walking in lines to ensure no spot was missed. The pond, 2 miles away, was dragged, even though there was no way Joshua could have walked that far in such a short time. Every registered offender within 50 miles was questioned, their homes searched with consent or warrants. Every house on the street was searched with permission from the owners. When it came to Mr. Abernathy's place, Mrs. Chen across the street mentioned she had seen him leave with a suitcase that very afternoon, just a couple hours after Joshua disappeared. She remembered because it was unusual for him to go anywhere. The police did a walk around the property, checking for any signs of forced entry or disturbance, but found nothing suspicious. The old dog kennel in the back was noted, but with its rotting boards and gaps, it looked too flimsy to conceal anything, so the officers gave it only a cursory glance before moving on. Without probable cause, and with Abernathy apparently gone, they moved on to more urgent leads. Days turned into a blur of search parties, media interviews, and sleepless nights. Sarah couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop blaming herself for letting him play outside alone, even though she had done it hundreds of times before without incident. Ethan threw himself into the search with a determination that bordered on obsession. He took indefinite leave from work, spent every waking hour either searching or coordinating with volunteers. They printed thousands of flyers, plastered Joshua's face on every telephone pole and shop window within a 100-mile radius. Gas stations, grocery stores, rest stops on the highway, all carried his picture and information. The tips came in by the hundreds, each one followed up no matter how unlikely. Someone thought they saw a boy matching Joshua's description at a gas station 3 towns over. Another person was sure they had seen him at a shopping mall with a strange man. A truck driver called to say he had seen a child who looked like Joshua at a rest stop 2 states away. Every lead was followed, every sighting investigated, but they all led nowhere. It was as if Joshua had simply vanished into thin air from his own backyard, taken by the wind itself. Mr. Abernathy returned from his trip a week after Joshua disappeared. The police questioned him at his door, and he had a solid alibi. He showed receipts from his sister's place in Florida, hotel bills, gas station receipts from the drive, even a dated photograph his sister had taken of them together at a restaurant. He said he had left in a rush that same evening, driving straight through the night, and had receipts proving he arrived in Florida the next morning, just hours after Joshua vanished. He expressed appropriate concern about the missing boy, said he would keep an eye out, but otherwise continued his solitary existence next door. Sometimes Ethan would see him puttering around his yard and feel an irrational anger. How could anyone just go about their normal life when Joshua was missing? After 2 weeks, the official search was scaled back. The police captain explained that they would continue investigating, but the massive ground searches couldn't continue indefinitely. The volunteers gradually stopped coming. The media moved on to other stories, and the Hallbrooks were left with a grief that threatened to swallow them whole. Their perfect life had become a living nightmare, made worse by the not knowing. Was Joshua hurt, scared, cold, hungry? Was he calling for them? The questions tortured them every minute of every day, an endless loop of horror and hope. Ethan turned their home office into what looked like a detective's investigation room. Maps covered the walls with pins marking every possible sighting, every tip, every location that had been searched. Timelines were drawn and redrawn, trying to find some pattern everyone had missed. He created a website, managed social media pages dedicated to finding Joshua, and spent his nights reading through missing children databases, hoping to find some connection, some clue that would bring his son home. He corresponded with other parents of missing children, joined online forums, became an expert in child abduction cases. Sarah tried to hold things together, but it was like trying to hold water in her hands. She went back to work after a month because sitting at home was driving her crazy. But teaching other people's children when her own was missing felt like a betrayal. She would see a student with red hair and have to excuse herself to cry in the bathroom. The other teachers were supportive, but she could see the pity in their eyes, the relief that it wasn't their child who had disappeared. Parents looked at her differently at school events, torn between wanting to comfort her and being terrified that her tragedy might somehow be contagious. Their marriage began to strain under the weight of their grief. They blamed themselves, sometimes blamed each other, though they tried not to. Ethan couldn't understand how Sarah could even think about returning to normal life when Joshua was still missing. Sarah couldn't watch Ethan destroying himself with his obsessive searching, wearing himself down to nothing. They loved each other, but their grief had created a chasm between them that seemed to grow wider every day. They went to counseling, but sitting in that office talking about their feelings seemed pointless when their son was gone. The first Christmas without Joshua was unbearable. Sarah insisted on putting up his stocking, buying presents that sat unopened under the tree. She wrapped them in the same superhero paper Joshua loved, wrote his name on the tags in her careful handwriting. Ethan spent the entire day at his computer, checking forums and databases, unable to participate in even the pretense of holiday celebration. Family members tried to visit, to provide comfort, but their presence only highlighted Joshua's absence. The house felt empty no matter how many people were in it, a hollowness that no amount of company could fill. The first anniversary of Joshua's disappearance was marked with a candlelight vigil in the town square. Hundreds of people came, many who had never even met the Hallbrooks but had been touched by their story. There were speeches about hope, about never giving up, about the strength of community. Local politicians promised continued support. Law enforcement renewed their commitment to the case. Ethan and Sarah stood there, holding candles in each other, trying to find comfort in the support, but mostly just feeling the weight of a year without their son. The local news covered the vigil, and for a brief moment, Joshua's case was back in the public eye, but it faded again within days. Private investigators were hired with money they couldn't afford to spend, taking out loans against their house to pay the fees. Each one came with promises and hope, new techniques and fresh eyes, but left with apologies and empty hands. Psychics contacted them, claiming to have visions of Joshua's location. Despite knowing better, Ethan and Sarah followed up on some of these claims, desperate enough to grasp at any possibility, no matter how unlikely. They drove to remote locations based on vague descriptions, dug in fields where someone claimed to have sensed Joshua's presence. Each false lead felt like losing Joshua all over again. Years passed with a cruel sameness. Every ring of the phone could be the call they were waiting for. Every young boy glimpsed from a distance could be Joshua. They celebrated his birthdays with a cake no one ate, kept his room exactly as he had left it, his bed still unmade from his last night at home. His drawings remained taped to the refrigerator. His height marks on the doorframe stopped at 6 years old. Friends and family tried to gently suggest therapy, support groups, maybe even considering the possibility that Joshua might not come home. But Ethan and Sarah couldn't give up. Giving up would mean accepting he was gone, and they couldn't do that. The case went cold officially after 3 years, though no one said those words to the Hallbrooks. The detective assigned to it retired, replaced by someone younger who promised to look at everything with fresh eyes but found nothing new. The case file grew thick with reports and dead ends, stored in a box in the police station basement with too many others just like it. The website Ethan maintained got fewer and fewer visitors. The Facebook page dedicated to finding Joshua became a place where Ethan posted memories and old photos, talking to his missing son through the internet, telling him about their days, promising they would never stop looking. By the 5th anniversary, Even the annual vigil had grown smaller. Life had moved on for everyone else, but the Hallbrooks remained frozen in that summer day when their world had stopped. They had learned to function, to go through the motions of living, but joy had become a foreign concept. Laughter felt like a betrayal. How could they be happy when Joshua might be out there somewhere, needing them? They existed in a state of perpetual waiting, their entire lives on hold for a reunion that might never come. It was a few days after that 5th anniversary when Ethan noticed something odd about Mr. Abernathy. The old man was in his backyard, doing something Ethan had never seen him do before, working on that ancient dog kennel that had sat untouched for years. He was adding new boards to it, reinforcing the walls, and strangest of all, installing what looked like a heavy-duty padlock on the door. The kennel had been falling apart for so long that seeing someone actually maintaining it was jarring. Why would anyone need to lock up an empty dog kennel? Curiosity got the better of Ethan, and he walked over to the fence that separated their yards. Abernathy saw him coming and immediately stopped what he was doing, his body language becoming defensive, almost guilty. Ethan tried to keep his voice casual as he asked about the repairs, mentioning that he hadn't seen Abernathy working on the kennel before. Abernathy mumbled something about wanting to fix it up to store garden tools, said the neighborhood had too many thieves these days, couldn't be too careful. When Ethan offered to help, maybe share some of his own tools, Abernathy quickly declined, said he preferred to work alone. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable, with Abernathy clearly wanting Ethan to leave him alone. But something about the interaction stuck with Ethan. The way Abernathy had positioned himself between Ethan and the kennel, the nervous energy in his responses, the way his eyes had darted around as if checking to see if anyone else was watching, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he held his hammer. Later, Ethan would realize this was likely Abernathy's guilt and paranoia finally getting the better of him after 5 years. The old structure was deteriorating, and he had become obsessed with the idea that it might collapse and reveal his secret. The padlock was his irrational attempt to keep people away from what he had hidden. It was probably nothing, Ethan told himself at the time. 5 years of searching for Joshua had made him suspicious of everything, and everyone. Still, the feeling nagged at him, a persistent itch in the back of his mind that wouldn't go away. 3 days later, a summer storm rolled through town with unusual violence. Thunder shook the houses, lightning split the sky, and the wind howled like something alive and angry. Tree branches whipped against windows, and the rain came down in sheets so thick you couldn't see across the street. Ethan and Sarah huddled inside, watching the news reports of damage across the county. In the morning, they discovered a large branch from their oak tree had fallen, taking out a section of the fence between their yard and Abernathy's. Ethan went out to assess the damage, figuring he would need to call someone to remove the branch and fix the fence. The morning air was fresh and clean after the storm, everything washed and gleaming in the early sunlight. As he stood there in the morning light, he found himself with a clear view of Abernathy's backyard, including that old dog kennel. The storm had knocked the padlock loose, leaving it hanging open, and more importantly, Ethan could see that some of the old boards on the kennel floor had been warped and loosened by the rain and wind. Abernathy's car wasn't in his driveway, and Ethan knew the old man usually went to the grocery store early on Sunday mornings, one of his few predictable routines. The smart thing would have been to ignore it, to mind his own business and wait for the fence to be repaired. But that nagging feeling from a few days ago returned stronger than ever. Before he could talk himself out of it, Ethan found himself climbing over the fallen branch and walking toward the kennel. His heart was pounding, though he couldn't say exactly why. It was just an old dog kennel, probably full of rusty garden tools, just like Abernathy had said. The door creaked as Ethan pulled it open, the sound loud in the quiet morning. Inside, the kennel looked ordinary enough at first glance, but the storm had done more damage than was immediately apparent. The heavy rain had warped some of the floorboards, and one section in particular had buckled upward slightly. It was a newer piece of wood, different in color from the rest, and the storm had loosened whatever had been holding it in place. Ethan knelt down and pressed on it. The board moved easily now, revealing that it was actually a carefully crafted trapdoor that had been sealed tight for years until the storm compromised it. His hands were shaking as he lifted the warped wood completely. Underneath was darkness and a smell that made Ethan's stomach turn, musty and wrong, like something that had been closed up for far too long. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it down into what appeared to be a small cellar, maybe 4 feet deep. At first, he couldn't process what he was seeing. There was something wrapped in a blue tarp at the bottom, small, about the size of a child. Ethan's mind refused to complete the thought. He lowered himself down into the space, his legs barely holding him. With trembling hands, he reached for the corner of the tarp and pulled it back. The first thing he saw was fabric, faded but still recognizable as the dinosaur pattern from Joshua's favorite pajamas, the ones he had insisted on wearing to bed the night before he disappeared. Then he noticed the strands of red hair, somehow still visible after all these years. The world stopped. Time stopped. Everything stopped, except the scream that tore from Ethan's throat. Ethan didn't remember calling 911. He didn't remember climbing out of that horrible place. He only remembered holding what was left of his son, rocking back and forth in Abernathy's backyard, sobbing so hard he couldn't breathe. The police found him there 20 minutes later, still cradling the small bundle, unable to let go. The arrest happened quietly. Abernathy returned from the grocery store to find his house surrounded by police cars. He didn't run, didn't resist, just stood there with his shopping bags in his hands as they read him his rights. The neighbors came out of their houses, watching in shocked silence as the man they had lived next to for decades was led away in handcuffs. The truth came out in pieces during the interrogation. Abernathy broke down completely, confessing everything through tears and stammering words. That day, 5 years ago, he had been home, not in Florida as he had claimed. He had been watching from his window as Joshua played in his backyard. The boy had been so happy, so full of life, and Abernathy had been so lonely, had been alone for so many years. His own son had died in a car accident 30 years ago. Would have been about Joshua's age if he had lived. In a moment of desperate loneliness and confused thinking, Abernathy had called to Joshua over the fence, told him he had found a puppy, and asked if he wanted to see it. Joshua, trusting and excited about puppies like any 6-year-old, had squeezed through a gap in the fence that adults hadn't even noticed existed. He had followed Abernathy into his house willingly, chattering about how much he loved dogs. Once inside, reality had crashed down on Abernathy. He realized what he had done, knew he couldn't let Joshua go home and tell his parents about coming into the strange neighbor's house. Joshua had started to get scared, said he wanted to go back to his daddy. There had been a struggle when Abernathy tried to stop him from leaving. Joshua had pulled away, tried to run, and had fallen backward, hitting his head on the corner of a coffee table. Abernathy swore he hadn't meant for it to happen, swore he had never intended to hurt the boy, but Joshua wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, and Abernathy had panicked. He knew about the hidden cellar under the dog kennel, a leftover from the previous owner who had used it to store moonshine during Prohibition. In his panic, that seemed like the only solution. He had wrapped Joshua in a tarp from his garage and hidden him there. Then, in a desperate attempt to create an alibi, he had quickly packed a suitcase and left immediately, driving through the night to Florida to visit his sister. He arrived the next morning, established his presence with receipts and photos, stayed for a week as planned, all while knowing what he had left behind in that hidden cellar. For 5 years, he had lived with the secret, right next door to the grieving parents. He had watched them search, watched them slowly fall apart, and said nothing. The guilt had eaten at him, he claimed, had made him sick, but not sick enough to confess, not sick enough to give the Hallbrooks the closure they desperately needed. He had thought about moving away many times, but was terrified that new owners might discover the cellar. So he stayed, trapped by his own horrible secret. The recent repairs to the kennel had been driven by paranoia, a growing fear that the deteriorating structure might collapse and reveal what was hidden beneath. The town reeled from the revelation. How could this have happened in their safe little community? How could they have lived next to a monster and never known? Parents held their children closer, looked at their neighbors with new suspicion, wondered what other secrets might be hiding behind familiar faces. The media descended again, even more intensely than when Joshua had first disappeared. The story of the boy found under the dog kennel made national news, a horrible reminder that danger often comes from the most unexpected places. Ethan and Sarah finally had answers, but answers brought no peace. They could finally lay Joshua to rest properly, could finally stop wondering where he was, but the knowledge of what had happened, of how close he had been all along, was almost unbearable. 5 years of searching, and he had been just yards away the entire time. 5 years of Abernathy watching them grieve, knowing exactly where their son was. The funeral was held on a gray September day. The entire town came, filling the church and spilling out onto the street. People who had searched for Joshua, who had prayed for his return, who had never given up hope, came to say goodbye. The small coffin, covered in flowers and toy trucks, seemed impossibly tiny at the front of the church. Sarah and Ethan sat in the front row, holding each other, finally able to mourn properly, but destroyed by the cruelty of it all. Abernathy was charged with involuntary manslaughter, concealing a death, and child endangerment. His lawyer tried to argue for leniency based on his age and supposed remorse, but the judge showed no mercy. The man who had stolen 5 years from a grieving family, who had hidden a child's body while watching his parents' desperate search, would spend the rest of his life in prison. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was all the justice the system could provide. The Hallbrook house went up for sale 6 months later. Ethan and Sarah couldn't stay there, couldn't look out their window at that backyard where Joshua had played, couldn't see that dog kennel every day. They moved to another state trying to start over, though starting over seemed impossible when such a huge piece of their lives was missing. They went to therapy, joined support groups for grieving parents, tried to find some way to live with their loss. The house next door, Abernathy's house, stood empty. No one wanted to buy it, not after what had been found there. Eventually, the city condemned it, and it was torn down. The lot stood vacant, grass growing wild where evil had hidden in plain sight. Some people said it should be turned into a memorial garden for Joshua, but others just wanted to forget, to pretend it had never happened. The truth was that it had happened, in their perfect little town, in their safe neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. A little boy had vanished from his own backyard, and the answer had been right next door all along. It was a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters, that evil can hide behind a familiar face, that sometimes the danger we fear from strangers is nothing compared to the secrets buried right next to us. If this story touched your heart or reminded you to hold your loved ones closer, please hit the like button below. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that explore the depths of human nature, both dark and light. Share your thoughts in the comments about how communities can better protect their children while maintaining the trust that makes neighborhoods feel like home.